X-Talks is the industry leader in connecting life science, food, healthcare, and medical device professionals. The X-Talks Life Science podcast features insightful conversations with industry experts about all things pharma, biotech, and more.
Hello and welcome to the X-Talks Life Science Podcast. I'm Ayesha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at xtalks.com. And this week, I'm delighted to introduce a special guest on the show. We have with us today Dr. Jennifer Gudeman, who is the Senior Vice President, Medical and Clinical Affairs at Avadel Pharmaceuticals, which is a biopharmaceutical company focused on innovative solutions to the development of medications that disrupt treatment paradigms and address unmet needs and conditions like narcolepsy, which is a complex and lifelong sleep disorder. Dr. Gudeman joined Avadel in 2020, and this was a critical time for the company as the team had submitted an NDA for a treatment that had the potential to improve the standard of care in narcolepsy. Dr. Gudeman helped continue the clinical development of Lumryz through to its approval, which is the company's lead candidate. And that was approved last May. And it's the first and only FDA approved once-at-bedtime oxybate for people living with narcolepsy. To learn more about that approval and the unmet needs, clinical development, and where the science is heading in the sleep disorder space, let's turn to Dr. Gudeman or Jennifer right now. Thank you so much for being on the show.
It's my pleasure, Ayesha. I'm so excited to speak with you today.
Likewise, I'm looking forward to our conversation about a space that you don't hear too much about every day, but it's so important. So I'm really happy to have you here and really excited to learn more and share with the audience. And so I'd like to take a couple of steps back and learn more about you. And so could you tell us a bit about your professional and educational background and how you found yourself at Avadel?
I'd be delighted to. So for background, I have a doctorate of pharmacy. I've spent more than 2 decades in the pharmaceutical industry. I've worked in a variety of different therapeutic areas. The majority of the time I worked in women's health, and I thought I would stay focused on women's health until it was time for me to retire. But an opportunity arose at Avadel, and I'd had the good fortune of working for our CEO, Greg Divis, previously. I knew the type of CEO he is, where putting the patients at the center is not just lip service. It really defines our values and how we focus on what we do every day. And as I was learning more about narcolepsy, I appreciate so much what you said in the intro, that we don't hear a lot about narcolepsy. And so even though I'm a pharmacist by background, I've been in industry for a very long time, I had some preconceived notions about narcolepsy. And as I was reading more, I found myself having such heart for people who live with this chronic, debilitating neurological disorder. One of the pieces of information that really propelled me to want to join this team, and I still refer to all the time, is a 2014 publication from the FDA called Voice of the Patient. And this was based upon a meeting that they had held, a patient-focused drug development program that had been held with people with narcolepsy and their supporters to understand the unique challenges that this community faces and to better inform future drug development. There's a lot that stands out. I could spend probably an hour talking about it. But in terms of brevity, the fact that these people have been labeled as lazy and incompetent and kind of internalizing shame for something that's not their fault whatsoever really made me want to be part of a company that was looking to disrupt the status quo. Yeah. And then what I also read about in that report was a medication called sodium oxybate. And sodium oxybate had been FDA approved since 2002, and it had helped a number of people, as I saw described in that report. But it came with a dosing regimen that I don't think many of us could fathom following in our day-to-day life. And that dosing regimen is the requirement to take a single dose at bedtime and then to wake up 2.5 to 4 hours later, so in the middle of the night,
to
take a second dose of medication. I mean, you think about all of the drugs that are on the market, and before we had extended release, medications used to be taken 3 times a day or 4 times a day. But this was certainly the first one, aside from some antibiotics that for a short period of time may require dosing every 6 hours. This was the first time I'd ever heard of a chronic condition where someone was supposed to incorporate waking up in the middle of the night to take that dose. And so Avadel was a company that was founded on drug delivery technology. And what Avadel has been able to solve is formulating an extended release version of sodium oxybate that allows for that single dose at bedtime.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that information. And again, I think not a lot of people may be aware of that. And that's a huge unmet need in terms of having a treatment, but it not being so accessible or convenient for patients.
That's right.
It just adds burden to the disease and the treatment around it. And so you did sorry, let me start that again. I'd like to know a bit more about narcolepsy in terms of how the condition manifests and how prevalent it is, the biological mechanisms, and also symptoms, and how it specifically affects people's day-to-day life.
Sure. Happy to speak about this. So first, narcolepsy impacts only about 1 out of 2,000 people in the United States. So about 170,000 total. And it's important to understand that it is rare because there's many people who have narcolepsy who don't know anyone else who has narcolepsy. What we've seen is there's a lot of benefit in psychosocial support. So there's various community groups where people can connect and really speak to each other. The cardinal symptom that all people with narcolepsy have is called excessive daytime sleepiness, or EDS. And I always say that name does not do justice what these individuals live with. It's akin for someone with narcolepsy to you or I being sleep deprived for 48 to 72 hours. And sleep is universal. I hope you had a good night's sleep last night. I hope people listening had a good night's sleep.
Yeah, absolutely. It's critical.
It's critical. Every facet, right? Yeah. And so we all know if you've had a red eye or if you just had a really bad night of sleep or limited sleep, how that can impact how we function at work, how we function in relationships. And so for these individuals, they're just chronically having this pathological sleepiness and these irrepressible needs to sleep during the day, oftentimes at really inconvenient, inopportune times. Could be sitting in a meeting or spending time with friends or family, or while driving a car, which clearly poses safety risks for that individual and for the public. So that's the cardinal symptom. There's 2 different types of narcolepsy. Narcolepsy type 1 is due to a lack of a neuropeptide called orexin. So we have a clear etiology for narcolepsy type 1. And then the symptom that separates type 1 is a symptom called cataplexy. This is a sudden loss of voluntary muscle control, and it's typically in response to an emotion. So if someone is made to laugh, or they're surprised, or they feel angry, that could trigger a cataplexy attack. And there's a range of how that could manifest. It could be focal, and it just results in maybe some facial drooping, someone could drop something. Or it could be a full body attack of cataplexy where someone would fall to the ground, completely conscious, but unable to move. And because this happens in response to emotional triggers, you can imagine some people just start to isolate themselves from the outside world so that they're not participating. And of course, that can add to a whole host of just challenging aspects. With narcolepsy type 2, the etiology is not well understood. Unfortunately, there's a lot of research that's going on to try to better elucidate that. People with type 2 narcolepsy don't experience cataplexy, but either of those types, there's kind of 3 classical symptoms that round out the narcolepsy pentad. So disturbed nighttime sleep is something that was surprising to me to learn about, because what I knew about narcolepsy, people were sleepy during the day, and I didn't think about the impact to the night. So people with narcolepsy will fall asleep quickly, generally speaking, but their sleep is constantly shifting in and out of various stages. They don't have consolidated, refreshing sleep. So they're sleeping for a normal amount of time, but that next day, just not waking up and feeling refreshed. There's also symptoms that include sleep paralysis and hallucinations, specifically hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations. So those occur as someone is falling asleep or as they're waking up, and they can be incredibly vivid, very frightening. A common recurring theme is someone breaking into your home and wanting to cause you harm, where the person just cannot differentiate. This isn't like a dream, it is truly lifelike. And then sleep paralysis, where typically when we're dreaming, our muscles are paralyzed. We experience atonia so that we don't act out our dreams. Because narcolepsy results in this inability to maintain the sleep-wake cycle, people may wake up and they're experiencing that paralysis, but they're awake and they can't move. So it gets very frightening. And if you think about all of those symptoms together, they don't even sound like they would fit one condition. And so it's difficult, and it really takes a skilled clinician to help in that patient interview understand what that particular patient is experiencing.
Wow. Indeed, you wouldn't expect all of those symptoms in one condition, like you said. That's and so many unmet needs to address all of those complexities and all of those very, very significantly debilitating symptoms, indeed. So, and in terms of I think the unique challenges, I think you did touch on that, what the unique challenges are for people that have narcolepsy in their day-to-day life. And before something like Lumryz or even oxybate, taking it in its previous formulation, how do people, or how have they coped with the disease?
So a mainstay of treatment going back to the 1950s, so decades and decades, has been stimulants, amphetamine-based stimulants or stimulants like methylphenidate or Ritalin. And these can be very effective when they're taken in the morning, and they help with the excessive daytime sleepiness. They don't do anything to address the disrupted nighttime sleep. And in fact, sometimes they can exacerbate that because, of course, a side effect of stimulants is insomnia. There's been a real advance in terms of the number of treatments that have become available in the last decade, which is fantastic for patients. Having more options to treat and to tailor a condition like this is so important. So there's a number of alerting agents that have become available as well, medications like modafinil with the brand name Provigil. The oxybate medications I mentioned were originally approved in 2002. With Lumryz, this is an extended release form of sodium oxybate. So that class of oxybates, they're the only medications that are taken at bedtime. And when I mention the symptom of cataplexy, only the oxybate medications are approved to treat that symptom, along with an alerting agent, which is called Wakix, the brand name of pitolisant. That's a medication that's taken in the day and also approved for EDS and cataplexy.
And so how does Lumryz work in terms of its specific mechanism of action?
So like a lot of medications, specific mechanism of action is not fully understood. What is known is this is a GABA B agonist. And what's clearly been demonstrated with oxybates in general and with Lumryz specifically is that at night, they will help consolidate sleep. And so the way that sleep is measured, patients will be hooked up to something called a polysomnogram, which is measuring brain activity, muscle activity, eyes, among other aspects. And so in terms of the various stages of sleep, with the oxybate medications, they help to improve the amount of time spent in slow wave sleep. Slow wave sleep is the sleep that we really rely upon to restore us, to make us feel refreshed the next day. So not entirely understood how the mechanism of action is, but we do know that there's improvements in how one sleeps.
And what was the journey like for the development of Lumryz? And I know you assisted in getting that through to the FDA approval that the medication won last year in May. So congratulations on that. Big step indeed. And so how was that journey like to the approval?
In one word, long. It was a long journey. I think that there's the coolest origin story, though, for why Avadel worked to develop this medication. So the company, our name is based upon advanced delivery. So looking at how to improve drug delivery. And many, many years ago, well before my time, 10 plus years ago, there was an employee who had a child with narcolepsy, and that child was receiving the first generation immediate release sodium oxybate. And so this employee saw firsthand the burden to the family when you're talking about chronically waking a child up to give a second dose of medication. And as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of drugs that have extended release formulations. But with sodium oxybate, this had been an intractable problem. It's a drug that's very highly water soluble. It's actually not a very potent drug, so it's given in a very high amount. It's dosed up to 9 grams. And that had made it difficult for anyone to successfully develop the extended release. So our pathway had included 11 pharmacokinetic studies, a large by orphan standards pivotal trial that demonstrated significant efficacy compared to placebo across all of the parameters tested, and then an open label study that generated long-term safety and tolerability. We were thrilled when we achieved that approval May 1st. Not only were we FDA approved for the treatment of EDS or cataplexy in adults with narcolepsy, but the agency also recognized that we are clinically superior to the twice nightly oxybate products. And part of their rationale in recognizing that major contribution to patient care is the recognition that it's antithetical to the goal of improving sleep if you're going to have that chronic sleep disruption.
Right. Indeed. And so when healthcare practitioners are considering treatment options, would Lumryz be, of course, as you mentioned, it was superior to the 2-dose regimen of oxybate, but in terms of other medications on the market, is this something that would be recommended as a monotherapy or in combination potentially with other treatments?
So most people who have narcolepsy will end up on polypharmacy because of the complexity of the symptoms. Often you will see medications that are paired together. And with any of the oxybate programs, they have a REMS, which is a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy. It's really important to ensure that you're mitigating the risk of abuse, misuse, or diversion. So we have programs in place to ensure that the medication can be safely used. I give that as context to say most clinicians will start off with a stimulant or an alerting agent. They're easier, frankly, to prescribe because they're available at local pharmacies, and they're oftentimes payer mandated to begin with those before there's an ability to move to an oxybate. One of the things that I think is so important for clinicians and patients to understand is if you take someone who has not been diagnosed with narcolepsy and they've not been treated, when they first go on a stimulant or an alerting agent, they're going to feel so much better than their baseline. It's incredible. But as time goes on, a really astute clinician will continue to ask the patient, are there things that you can't do because of your narcolepsy? And many times that will reveal someone's able to get through the day at work, but they come home and there's absolutely no energy for family, friends, housework, socialization. And so I think about our clinical trial as well as other pivotal trials with the oxybates. The majority of patients at baseline were already taking a stimulant or alerting agent, and yet they still qualified for participation. They were still pathologically sleepy. And just to kind of frame that up, at baseline, there's a test that was done in our clinical trial to assess how long people could stay awake if they were put into a darkened room. And overall, on average, it was only about 5 minutes that the participants could stay awake. It was the same in the group that was taking the stimulants or alerting agents as it was in the group that wasn't. And so I think that speaks to the fact that it is oftentimes necessary to augment with another medication like Lumryz.
And what are the Are there any future or further development plans for Lumryz? Is it being explored in other indications, and where is it going next?
Yes. So narcolepsy is considered a central disorder of hypersomnolence. And there's another central disorder of hypersomnolence called idiopathic hypersomnia. So IH, we obviously don't know what causes it, but like narcolepsy, the cardinal symptom is excessive daytime sleepiness. Some of the differences with idiopathic hypersomnia are the fact that there is sleep inertia. So for all of us, when we wake up in the morning, there's some degree of sleep inertia, that transition from, being asleep to waking up. But people with IH will have prolonged sleep inertia, also sometimes called sleep drunkenness, where they just really struggle to be able to transition out of that sleep state into wakefulness. There's right now only one medication that is approved to treat IH. And there was another patient-focused drug development meeting that took place in April to really underscore how this community needs more options. So with that as background, we were thrilled to announce in late July that we have initiated a phase 3 pivotal trial studying Lumryz in idiopathic hypersomnia. So we started that trial very recently and are really looking forward to evaluating the safety and efficacy for this adjacent condition.
And how do you see the field of sleep medicine really evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? And how have you seen in your time so far actually the developments leading up to something like Lumryz? And we talk about trends and all of that in the drug development space. And so what do you see for sleep medicine, and where would you like to see things heading?
So I'll say, just in my time, coming up on 4 years in this therapeutic area, I think there's already been tremendous advances. And one of the ways to underscore that, when I was going through the interview process, I was looking for medical society guidelines. This was in 2020. The last guidelines had come out in 2007. And, that's not typical.
Wow,
it reflected the fact that there'd been a dearth of development. And so the guidelines were updated in 2021, and there's even been new medications, such as Lumryz, that have been approved since then. And so having more options really shifts the conversation with the clinician and the patient to being less paternalistic and one of shared decision making. It's so important to involve a person with narcolepsy in choosing the medication that's going to fit into their lifestyle and that's going to be effective for those symptoms that are most debilitating to them. And now that we have more options, that is starting to happen. I think in my time, too, there's been this increasing recognition that narcolepsy is a 24/7 condition. It's not just about managing through for the daytime, but it's thinking about that patient the entirety of the day. And as you asked me to look ahead 5 to 10 years, which is always fun to do, right now there's a lot of excitement for the development of orexin agonists. So I mentioned earlier with narcolepsy type 1, this is due to a deficiency of orexin, and there's a lot of different sponsors that are at various stages of drug development. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see where that goes and ultimately to see where the orexin agonists fit into the treatment paradigm when they're available. And, there's no question that having more options for patients ultimately serves that community more. I also think there's the added benefit of having more voices talk about this rare and poorly understood condition will hope to increase awareness, just like talking to you today will. One of the things I don't think I've mentioned and I normally talk about so much, it's about 10 to 15 years on average from a patient developing symptoms until they're diagnosed.
Wow.
Isn't that incredible? And the symptoms most typically are going to start in late teens. And so you think about that, applying, trying to finish up high school, college, graduate work, career, the identity that one forms in their 20s. We really want to see that cycle from symptom onset to diagnosis shorten so that people don't have to live with the debilitating sleepiness. Mm-hmm. And if I'm allowed one last kind of future forward.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So the gold standard right now for diagnosing narcolepsy has been used for decades, and it's fairly onerous. It requires patients to come into a sleep lab, have an overnight study hooked up to all sorts of leads to for their sleep. And then the next day, they will have what's called MSLTs, or multiple sleep latency tests. And this is to evaluate how quickly people with narcolepsy go into REM or dream sleep. It's challenging, needless to say, when you're in an artificial environment of an office of trying to sleep. And, I credit all of these sleep clinicians because they try as much as possible to make it homey and to make it natural. But it's a challenge. And I really think everyone in this field would like to see an improvement that's less onerous. The other challenge with standard is with narcolepsy type 2, idiopathic hypersomnia. They oftentimes are very similar in terms of the sleep studies. And so there's not good retest reliability. And someone may be diagnosed initially with narcolepsy type 2. They might have to have another sleep study for insurance purposes. Their diagnosis changes to IH or vice versa. And that can be really confusing for patients. And so I think we need to understand better how to be able to differentiate the diagnosis of those two conditions.
Mm-hmm. And Avadel is pursuing development in both of these conditions. And is there anything else coming up for Avadel in similar or other indications? As I know, the company's focused on improving drug delivery methods for conditions with specific unmet needs.
So the closest thing on the horizon is we have submitted to the FDA an SNDA, a supplemental new drug application, for the treatment of pediatric narcolepsy. And, kind of going back to that origin story of what inspired us to start this odyssey of developing extended release, to be able to introduce a one-dose formulation of sodium oxybate that would allow not only the patient, the child, but the whole family that opportunity of a single dose. That's something we're asking for a lot. And we're really hopeful to receive a positive decision from FDA.
And I know you mentioned this, for another question that we were discussing, but in terms of the development of something like Lumryz, there are different stakeholders, and you mentioned that how patient input and patients and their caregivers alike, and like you said, this is something that impacts the whole family and the whole sort of system of connections and relationships around a patient. And so, who are the different stakeholders that you would like to see at the table in the development of something like Lumryz or some other medication for Avadel in the coming years? And because we hear a lot about having the patient voice at the table, what does that really mean? And who are the other stakeholders? We're also seeing partnerships between academia and industry and other players. And so with this very recent approval, what has your experience been in terms of who the stakeholders are and should be?
So for Avadel, the number one stakeholder is always going to be the patient who ultimately we're working to serve. And when I joined the company at the end of 2020, there had been a patient advisory group that had been established probably 4 years prior to joining. It stayed strong. We meet with these people with narcolepsy or PWN on a routine basis to really continue to learn and listen to their needs and their wants. We've also been able to bring the patient voice to the forefront by partnering with various social listening groups to understand what's being said in anonymous settings. We all know that sometimes there's what a patient may say to their doctor or their clinician, and there's what they may say to other people living with the disease, which can be a little bit more candid and revealing. And so we've been pleased to have a number of publications and posters and oral presentations to really further reveal that patient perspective. I think that you have to acknowledge the reality in the US. You can develop the best medication in the world, but if you don't have that buy-in from a payer perspective, it's not going to reach patients. And so we've been really pleased. I think payers inherently understand the value of what we bring to patients. And even though we've only been available for a short time, we have a really nice commercial insurance coverage that is available. And then at the end of the day, I mean, this is a medication that ultimately a sleep clinician, whether it's a physician, whether it's a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant, they're ultimately going to be the ones who first begin to discuss it with a patient. And so we've spent a lot of time working on publications where we're really attempting to address various questions that groups would have when you introduce a new medication. As one example, we looked at a number of different subgroups to understand the efficacy, looking at things like men and women, narcolepsy type 1, narcolepsy type 2, BMI, white race versus non-white race. And what we saw is a real consistency of effect. And so, regardless of the specific demographics and clinical characteristics, I think that's something that can provide some confidence to clinicians who are considering various treatments.
And what has been sort of a key learning in leading up to the approval of Lumryz, and in terms of challenges in drug development, and what do you think you've gleaned and learned as a team from this approval?
I think the biggest learning, it's not directly tied to drug development, but I think it's really important to consider, is because for 20 plus years, there'd only been one medication that was something taken during the middle of the night. There's what I call a don't ask, don't tell policy that occurred between patients and their providers. Oh. Providers understandably weren't necessarily asking, how's that middle of the night dose going? Right. Because if it wasn't going well, there really wasn't a different option that they could introduce. And similarly, I think a lot of patients didn't necessarily voice concerns. And so we've talked to a number of patients. We have really amazing ambassadors, several of whom came from our open label clinical study and then ultimately transitioned upon approval. And I think one of the things that just stands out to me so much is speaking with a young woman who, when she lived at home, her mom and her sister would wake her up for the middle of the night dose. When she moved out on her own for college, she thought she could do it. And she would have 5, 6, 7 alarm clocks, and she couldn't do it. And she described to us how it was terrible math. She would wake up and it would be more than 4 hours after the first dose. And would she forego that second dose altogether? That means she's only receiving half the dose at subtherapeutic, worse symptoms the next day. Or if she would take it, it would mean that she wouldn't be able to get up and attend her college classes or drive because there's restrictions after taking any oxybate dose. And when I asked her, I knew she had a great relationship with her sleep clinician. And when I said, did you ever bring this up? And this young woman said that she felt ashamed, that she felt like it was her fault and other people were able to do this. And that really just struck me so profoundly of how important it is, right? To create a safe, non-judgmental space where clinicians can really understand about that experience.
Right. And I think it just speaks to the fact as to how alone a lot of these kinds of patients may be feeling. And so having those support groups and I think that begins with the healthcare provider for sure to help lead that.
Yes, definitely.
Jennifer, thank you so much for all of those insights and for really shedding such amazing perspectives on narcolepsy, and then, of course, all of the work that Avadel has been leading in this space. Wish you all the best. And again, thank you so much for being on the show and for all of the work that you're leading.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Ayesha.
Absolutely. That's the end of this episode of the X Talks Life Science podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.
To join the X Talks community, visit xtalks.com and register for exclusive access to curated content like live webinars, news articles, and educational videos. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policy or position of Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.